over the last couple of weeks, Cardano has seen a serious correction, dropping as low as 76 cents from its peak of 133 cents, coming close to a 50% move to the downside. We're currently trading somewhere in between that at 93 cents. In this video, we're going to take a look at where Cardano could be headed based on its previous performance during similar timeframes. I also want to say Merry Christmas to you all. Depending on how much editing I can get done, most likely this video will be out on Christmas Day. So I hope you're all staying away from the charts and spending time with your family and friends. Even though, of course, nothing is quite as important as crypto, we have to give some time to other things like family and friends. Now, with that said, let's jump into Cardano. If we examine the recent price action of Cardano, look at only the last 2 years or so in isolation, we can see that Cardano has followed a pretty similar pattern. And that's been, it puts in a high, it puts in a second higher high, and then it moves down and puts in a low, oftentimes returning to the same low. We saw this happen here, where it returned to the same low multiple times and bounced up. Again, we got a move to the upside, a first lower high, bit of a retracement, a move up to a second high, and then a move down to a low that we kept returning to multiple times until, once again, we shot up, putting in our first high. And we can see this, the rejections that we always saw from these highs have so far, over the last 2 years, followed this line. And it looks like, well, it doesn't even look like it. We have been rejected once again from this line after coming back down from the low. We've come back up to meet this resistance and then ultimately drop down again. Now, what's interesting is if we take a look at these peaks, specifically these first peaks that we've seen from these double tops or sort of second moves higher, if we take a look at how far we drop after the first peak to the low, again, wick to wick, we can see this first cycle was about 30%. Well, sorry, this first time, not this first cycle. This second time, we dropped even further. We dropped about 34%. So, small bit of variation, but noticeably bigger. Here, what we've currently done, from wick to wick, from peak to top, we've dropped 42% so far. And now, if you take a look at current price from the peak to where we currently are, we're about 30%. So you could argue that we're just seeing this play out again. Again, if you look at the time periods that it takes for Cardano to put in these lower lows, if you take them from the high, you can see here, the first high here took us 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks roughly. From the second one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 roughly. And here, 1, 2, 3. Assuming we don't go in and put in a further low this week or next week. So you can argue that, hey, the bottom's in, it was shorter than before, but it was also the most volatile. We saw the furthest drop this time, even though it took us a shorter period of time. We will see that trend continue throughout the rest of this analysis. It's something that ADA has consistently done as time has gone on. But I just thought that point was interesting, the fact that this low usually drops at least 30%, and that we've always, well, at least for the last 2 years, rejected off this line, and we have done again very recently. And also, just from the way Cardano's price is actually moving, it looks like we might see what's happened twice over the last 2 years play out again, where we move from the high to the low, drop a similar amount, approximately 40% this time, and then move back up and put in a higher high. So if you wanted to trade this move, potentially the move to make for the very short term would be to open a long position here, as we might return back up to this resistance line once again in the next few weeks. And if you take a look at how long roughly between each peak it takes, we can see it varies. Here it was 8 weeks. This time, a bit longer, it's about 13 weeks. So again, this could be shorter and more volatile. If it's going to be shorter, you can put it less than 8 weeks, but that's peak to peak. I would probably, being more cautious, put it sometime in the middle. However, it could take longer, could take shorter. There's no way of knowing for sure. A contradiction to that statement, where approximately we'll see the price go up, a contradictory theory or hypothesis that could be a reason that we see Cardano trade down for at least the short term, is if we look back at 2019 and 2020. Over the course of this period, Cardano, for 66 weeks, so just over a year, Cardano's price displacements, meaning how far it moved from the start to the end, what was the price change over this period of time, was roughly 0. 66 weeks, and Cardano started at this low and it ended at this low. During this time, it made a series of moves. It put in a first high here, it put in a second higher high here, again similar to what we've seen here, first high and then second high, although you could argue this is also a double top as the prices are so close together. We then saw Cardano trade down for about 25 weeks before bottoming out, and once it bottomed out, it had a bit of a fake out, but then ultimately ended up lower than it was over the space of 12 weeks before it then started its bull run. Now, if we take a look at what we're currently going through and map these movements onto our current price, we can see that it actually looks almost identical, to be honest with you, at least up until the orange circle. We get this first move up, we get this first move up, a second higher high. Noticeably here, it's higher than the first high. And it is technically a higher high here, although looks very much like a double top. Anyway, we get this high, we then trade down, we get our low. Now what's different here is the time periods. And again, going back to the quicker movements. This first cycle, we saw 29 weeks, then 25 weeks, then 12. Here we saw 26, then 21, and then currently, it's not finished yet, but we're currently at 20 weeks of this orange to purple time frame. We don't know where this purple is going to end up, but the current date is 20 weeks. Now, while it is so far condensed, we still don't know where this is going to close out. And if it's going to follow what it did last cycle, it will most likely continue to trade down until we hit a low. And it might trade down up to this 66-week mark. We might get 66 weeks of this time period, roughly. And we might even see, potentially, the price return back down to the lows where it started. Now, a 24-cent Cardano does seem pretty inconceivable right now. And the drop that we would have to see from today's price to get to that low would be devastating, to be honest with you. It would be a minus 73% move. It would wipe the implications of having Cardano do a drop like this would most likely mean the rest of the crypto space is in a free fall. I don't think this is likely. And the reason I say that is, and there's a good excuse for it, is because this was the COVID sell-off. This here was COVID, these 3 weeks of crazy negative price action that caused Cardano to drop 70% from the blue to the low, which again is what we need to return to this low. This was COVID. Now, you could argue we got 70% here. There's an equal chance that we could get 70% of a drop here. I'm not saying it can't happen. I'm just saying there were other things at this time, global pandemics, for example, that influenced a lot of, everything dropped. Everything that wasn't a short sell lost money. And I don't think, or at least I hope not, but I hope we're not going to see anything like that play out now. So realistically, I don't think we should expect a 70% drop. However, that doesn't mean we shouldn't expect some kind of a drop. Another reason we should not expect a drop to these lows is last cycle, more noticeably, this blue, this second move, was lower than the previous two. Now here, we're well above these two. And again, we're following this steady trend upwards move. If we are going to see a pullback, and even if we are going to see the COVID 70% pullback from the top, that would bring us as low as 40 cents. I don't think we'll go to 40 cents. I think something like 70 cents isn't too far away. I mean, we've wicked as low as 75. I think we could potentially trade down for the next month up until mid-January. But again, nothing is guaranteed. If we take a look at how long we did trade down for, we can see that, zooming in here so we get a better look, from the peak to the low, it was 4 weeks, including this week. So technically 5. If we give ourselves 5 weeks from here, that's next week that we want to bottom out. If we're going to follow the same time kind of movements, you'll also remember that everything's been happening quicker this cycle. So if it was going to follow that pattern, which is reasonable to assume, follow the trend. If things have been happening quicker, why should they stop happening quicker? Technically, we've just had the quicker move, and it's taken us 3 weeks instead of 5. And now we're going to move back up. I personally think we will see price just trade sideways for a little while. Slightly a decline, we'll see ADA lose a bit of value, I think, personally. Again, I just think how similar these moves are, even up to the fine points where after we had this second high, we traded down, we got a small little rally, and then put in the lower low. We saw the exact same thing here where we traded down, we got a small little rally, and then put in the lower low. I know this move to the upside has broken that technically in terms of percentages, but realistically the moves still look extremely similar. Even the amount of time that we spent going up here was about 5-6 weeks. Here it was 5 or 6 weeks. I really do think we will probably follow something similar. We won't see as drastic of a sell-off, in my opinion, but I think we will see the sell-off. We're probably about 50% of the way there at the moment, 60, 70 maybe. But I think once we put in this low, if a bull run's going to happen, it'll happen after that. And another kind of indicator that suggests we have a small bit more to go is if you want to ignore this similarity with price action leading up to the halving, and you want to just base it off the 4-year cycle, the 4-year seasonality, we can see that the first correction that we get after the halving, with the halving, we rally up through the halving. This is our rally here, our first rally after the halving. Once we put in this top and we get a bit of a rejection, if we zoom in and take a look at how far we drop, here from the high to the low, we can see it's about 54%. I've overshot that a little bit. It's about 50%. If we zoom in and again take a look at how far we've fallen so far, from the high to the low, it's about 43. So you can say, oh, this cycle we're experiencing less volatility, things are happening quicker, and they're moving less. So 43% sounds about right of a drop to me. Or you can argue and say, we're most likely probably going to see this 50% drop, as the moves have been pretty similar, and that would bring us down to a 65-cent Cardano. Again, that's assuming that it's going to play out the same, which of course it doesn't have to. But it more or less, whichever way you look at it, whichever way you compare it to previous price action, whether you base it off the halving, whether you base it off the nearly identical price movement over the last 2 years, and copy and paste that to current day, that also suggests we're still in for a bit of a correction, depending on how you interpret it. Most likely we're going to see negative price action. And even if you believe in the second peak hypothesis, where we put in a peak, our second peak, and then return to the low, peak, return to a low, spend some time at that low, yes, most likely we will get our second peak in the next few weeks. But then that kind of indicates that we're going to see some kind of a big correction. And then you can make kind of relevant excuses like, oh, it'll take us 3 or 4 weeks to get back up to this high. Once we're back up here, the bull run will have started, so we might see a small correction again, but then the bull run will take off because it'll already be mid-February by then. Trump will be in office. He will have started buying Bitcoin. Whatever you want to say. Look, I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'm just putting the chart in front of you and saying, this is what's happened before. This is what's currently happening. This is what could potentially happen. It's up to you to decide. If you want my personal opinion, which again, opinion alert, not facts, okay, just what a human thinks on the internet, I think we'll probably see a bit of a correction. Nothing too major from where we currently are. Again, I think 65 cent is probably the lowest we'd go realistically. This could very well be the low, but I think we will probably spend January doing nothing, more or less. We kind of saw that last year, to be honest with you. January hit, and we traded sideways until February. We got February, and then we got our rally. In fact, you can almost line up these peaks kind of perfectly. This was 11th of December here. This was 2nd of December. So in terms of seasonality, what we got, January was nothing, did nothing for us. The counter to that is in 2023. January was really strong, and we traded up until February, where in February we traded down, and then in March we traded up. So there's always going to be an excuse for whatever you want to happen. There's always going to be a narrative. Either way, looking at the Bitcoin pair, currently what we're experiencing, we can see that basically since the start of the year, 2024, we've just traded down up until the start of November, where we had this crazy rally. We saw a 200% move from wick to wick, and then we've seen this pullback start where we have dropped so far roughly from peak wick to lowest wick about 40%, so more or less the same on the US dollar charts, we can see like the drop was 40% roughly on the USD from the top to the bottom. What I want to compare this to first is 2019 and 2020. Again, similarly to how we compared this time frame on the US dollar chart. And to do this, I'm going to zoom out a little bit first so that we can see them side by side. I know there's a lot of stuff on this, but we will go through it and explain it as we go. So first we start here at the end of 2018 with this green line. This is our kind of low. And we can see we get the exact same thing at almost the exact same price here at the end of 2023. We get this rally up, and back in 2018, 2019, it was 134% move. Here it was a 100% move, but it happened again over a much shorter time frame. From here, low to high, 17 weeks, 18 weeks technically. From here, low to high, 7 weeks. So again, notice that the time frame is much shorter. We then trade down and we drop 76% this first cycle. Here we drop 70%. So again, you're noticing less of a move, shorter time frame. The amount of time that we spend dropping is also much shorter. Here, 59 weeks from 2019 to 2020. Here, what we've dropped is 47 weeks. And that's basically from end of last year, December 2023, to more or less where we are now. And that's where the bottom was, here. So again, very obvious discrepancy in time periods where we're spending much less time this cycle compared to the previous cycle. And also the percentage moves that we're seeing, both up and down, are less. We can see up and down, smaller moves. Even this most recent move, where we went from basically the low to the high, this is slightly incorrect technically, from the low to the high, Cardano moved up just under 300% last cycle, just after the halving. Here we've had this move, the post-halving move up, you could say, is 200%. So it's basically it's 2/3 of what it was last cycle. Now, what does that mean for the future? What can we expect to see if it's going to follow what it did last time? Well, again, if you look at Cardano here, we can see that against Bitcoin, Cardano traded down for 23 weeks. Now, 23 weeks is a long time. And if you want to go 23 weeks, I've already got a line here, 23 weeks from the peak, that puts you mid-2025, when we bottom out against the Bitcoin pair. Not even when we peak or anything like this, when we bottom out. We then have basically at least half a year potentially of moving up against Bitcoin and Cardano. But again, what has Cardano been doing for the last year, for the last 2 years? It's been making the same moves, but to a lesser degree and in a much shorter period of time. So if you want to compare it to, say, this first downward move from the peak to the low, this was 59 weeks here, this was 47 weeks. So approximately you're looking at a 4/5 roughly of the move. So if we take 4/5 of 23, doesn't work out properly, but you're basically going to want to take away either 4 or 5 weeks, depending on whether you want to round it up or down. If we take away 4 weeks, it brings us to 19, puts us mid-April when we see our rally. 18 weeks brings us to the start of April, end of the first week of April. If you want to take a look at some of these drastic differences, like with the one we saw here with the first rally after the halving, and basically say 2/3 of what we got last cycle, you can take away 7 weeks, realistically, from 23, which would put you at 16 weeks, which would put you at mid-end of March, basically end of Q1. Again, assuming that things have to play out this way, which of course they don't, end of March does sound more reasonable in terms of when we could bottom out against Bitcoin and really see an alt season that in 2021 lasted for 35 weeks. If we're going to have 35 weeks of alt season after the low, mid-March, it's going to put you at the end of the year for when we peak out on all our alts against Bitcoin. Again, assuming that everything plays out the same. If you want to apply the same logic and say that we get a much shorter alt season because we had a much shorter bear run, or in terms of what we've seen over the last 2 years, much shorter compared to what we got over the last 3 years in the previous cycle, you want to take 1/3 off 35. For simplicity's sake, we'll just take off 11, or we'll do 12 because technically that's more accurate. It's going to put you at 23 weeks, which would mean we top out in September of 2025 When did we top out in 2021? September. Literally 30th of August here when we peaked. Basically the same day. 30th of August here, 1st of September here. I'm not saying that has to happen, but if Cardano is going to continue to follow the shorter and less volatile move that it has been following for years at this point, why should we assume that it will stop doing that now? Now, it could stop doing that now, and there'd be nothing you can do about it, because markets do just like to basically fuck you that way. Pardon my language, Merry Christmas. But, markets do what they want to do. There's no way of knowing for sure. An interesting thing that I do want to point out, though, is that going back to this green line that we mentioned at the start when we flipped to ADA Bitcoin, if we take a look at it back in 2018, when we first saw it sort of come to this price noticeably, which we benchmarked our percentage moves from, we can see that ADA actually came back and found support roughly at this price after the second peak. So we get first peak, second peak, and then we find support at this level roughly. And it's kind of the first support that we find after the second peak. So I know that's a bit of a mouthful, but first peak, second peak, first support that we find is at the same level. So it's almost doing a weird type of up, a U, down, symmetrically in a way. If we take a look at what we're currently seeing over this last year, it doesn't look quite as nice, this U, but basically what we've seen is this price here. We move up, we come down, and back up. We get the U to the second peak, and then the first support that we kind of find, potentially, again, it hasn't played out properly yet, hasn't played out fully, so we can't say for sure, but this low is at the same price, roughly. And this could be the first support that we see Cardano Bitcoin reach after the second peak, very similarly to how we saw it do it here, where it had this first peak, this first support after the second peak. Again, in terms of where we could see Cardano go, very quickly, for me, we've never seen Cardano go much higher than that 6,200 sat range. Last cycle, we only just touched it before we got rejected. I think we've seen Cardano make less volatile moves as time goes on. That's me. I will say I hold Cardano. I am a big believer in Cardano. I'm just being realistic. I don't think we're going to move above this line. I know there's always the scenario that this time's different. Yes, I agree with you. I think this time's different. I think we're going to see less volatility, because that's what we have been seeing. Since Cardano started, we've seen less volatility. We started off going up to these highs from these lows. We started putting in higher lows and lower highs. And potentially, I think we will continue to see that, basically. I mean, here, we didn't return to these lows this cycle. We were technically just above them. I think it will more or less be the same with the highs. I think we might get to 6,000 sats, maybe. That might be our ultimate peak this cycle. Or maybe 5,600 sats. I don't know. But ultimately, I think, it's going to be bullish in the short term. Again, if we turn off logarithmic, we can see just how far we've got to move before we even get close to these highs. Logarithmic does kind of remove the perspective of how far higher we have to go. We have still got so much room to the upside. And from current prices, assuming that 5,500 sats is the peak, we've still got all this move. And that's against Bitcoin. And that's assuming that crypto goes up in a bull run, which I think it does historically. Call me crazy, but I think Bitcoin and crypto does go up during the crypto bull runs. So look, food for thought. Ultimately, I hope you guys are having a Merry Christmas and that you're not worrying too much about crypto. If you're holding the long term, you're gonna be fine, in my opinion. Wishing you guys a really, 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 really Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. And hopefully I will upload more next year and I'll see you then. So take care and peace.